From the world of AV programming and control with James King, I'm Steve Greenblatt, and this is Ask the Programmer. James, I'm glad we're back and we have a fun guest today. So how are you? Just start with that.
Oh, I'm doing good. And these podcasts are always better when we have a guest because I'm sure people don't want to hear me talking.
Oh, no, I'm sure.
Not true.
but that voice is Richard Mitchell, and he's from Biamp. He's actually the Education Solutions Manager. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys. I've been a long-time listener, a first-time guest, so pretty excited about joining in the conversation.
And we're glad you're here because honestly, this is what the podcast is about. You know, we want to make this something that is hitting a target audience, and the way we connected was basically chatting at a trade show, which is always very rewarding, and is appreciate you reaching out and expressing your interest in the show. And just, I guess, a good place for us to start maybe is why don't you just share a little bit about what either drew you to the podcast, how you found out about it, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I want to say it actually just popped up in a random search as, I was looking for AV podcast topics because I love to go walking in the early mornings and late afternoons. And I listened to the first episode, and honestly, I was probably like 4 or 5 shows in before I finally circled back around and got to my house. But, the topics are just very timely. And I liked that. I think a lot of people in the industry are kind of somewhat introverted. And it was great to have the perspectives that I have about the AV industry shared by other introverts like myself. Like, yeah, I can definitely turn it on for a trade show or for an event, but then need to go back and power down for a little while and recharge the batteries. So it was great to hear your perspectives. James, I think you have a great perspective. Again, having that perspective from the higher education segment was really exciting to me because I think it's an underserved, very large group within the AV industry. And it doesn't fit into a corporate box very well because no two universities are similar most of the time. So it was great to hear, that the challenges and rewards of the higher education segment. And yeah. And I've been in higher education for 18, 19 years, and then finally made the transition over to the hardware manufacturer, which was just an awesome transition.
That's good.
Actually,
go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say one of the reasons that it's kind of neat that we James and I got together was because of our differing perspectives. And how we're coming at programming from different backgrounds, different angles, and that's kind of what makes the conversation a little bit more balanced. But James, why don't you go from there?
I mean, just to add on to that, I mean, as even Richard mentioned, in higher ed, we're the same way. Even though we're all close, like Joe Way and name drop retreat there, and Tim from Rutgers and all us, we talk, but our schools are different. So we have different views. Like Steve, who's from a small religious college in Pennsylvania, to now me at a large R1 institution in Nevada. Like, we all have our different views, different perspective, but we all have the same goal.
And I would expand upon that. It's like also the funding structures of these universities are wildly different. Some have very defined budgets. Some, there are no budgets for AV, and kind of navigating within the silos of some universities. And then some are very flat with the way that they're able to kind of get their arms around their AV needs. So it's fascinating from an AV perspective. It's also just fascinating from like a management kind of perspective as well. So it's just, I have never bumped into 2 universities that are doing it identically the same. So it's just, I feel like it keeps you young because it's always new and always fresh. So.
Nope, I agree.
Which is very interesting. I think from a programming standpoint too, the way we look at doing a project is I'm sure very different, because when you're in control of more of your variables, in an education standpoint, you can make more choices and you can approach things a lot differently. I come very much from the outside, not even doing integration, but more so just specializing in software, and we get exposed to a whole gamut of either applications, clients, players, all sorts of things. So it's bringing, I think one of the advantages is bringing that knowledge to the table, but one of the disadvantages is you can't really make stuff as targeted as you could likely in an education area.
Yeah, and I think, I was happy when the position opened up at Biamp, and, it seemed to work out really well. But I think they were specifically looking for somebody that was an insider, that had a kind of that perspective in the challenges that are facing the higher ed segment, that are just vastly different than the enterprise segment. The enterprise, equally challenging in a number of ways. But, in an enterprise environment, if you get 6 or 7 people pretty much on board with a concept or a piece of hardware, generally they can move very quickly and make big change. Where the universities, there are some universities where the decision makers, if you just brought the decision makers together for AV, it may be 24 groups within a university, and each of them may have different kind of opinions about how to approach AV projects. A lot of them will have wildly different budgets. Master program kind of level schools usually have more finance as compared to undergraduate, et cetera. So again, it's just a fascinating and very fun segment to work in. And if you don't enjoy a very dynamic kind of environment, you're probably not going to love higher ed.
So tell us a little bit. I know your background is working for higher ed institutions and doing AV design, and what experience or how have you touched control programming, what does the importance of understanding control program mean to you in your role?
Yeah, so I am one of the anomalies in AV. I was never in a band, and I do not play an instrument. So I am like one of the 3%ers out there that
I'm here.
Me too, believe it or not.
Right. So I actually started in higher ed with kind of a marketing and communication background. I was in Washington, D.C. at a large private school, being a director of online marketing, managing websites, et cetera. And then I moved to North Carolina for a light blue large state institution. And that was my first kind of dig into AV specifically. I was very much on the outside. At the time, it was kind of an era where primarily you wrote checks to integrators. They would come and manage everything for you. And I had a couple of opportunities to kind of get my arms around AV in a very kind of introductory way. And I just fell in love with, figuring, it's like a puzzle that you have to figure out to make these things work, and working with a good integrator, making sure that it is executed very well. And I just loved it so much that I wanted to do it full time. So I then transferred to a North Carolina university that has dark blue. And I literally started out as a classroom technician because I just love the industry so much, and it's very fulfilling. And by the time I left the university, I was a senior AV design engineer, designing a vast majority of our spaces on our campus. And from a programming perspective, I will admit, do not ever let me program anything for you. No, just don't let that happen. But, I went to Crestron's 101, 201, and then I figured out I'm going to leave this to people like James and yourself that can actually program these things. Then I went to Extron's, entry level, and then their Python programming class. And that's where I was like, this is wonderful. This is not for me. But I took a lot of that knowledge of what these systems are capable of, and then synthesize them down to what we needed them to be able to do. So while I may not have been programming it, it was great to have that knowledge so that when I was working with the programmers, I could say, I'm pretty sure it can do this thing that I'm trying to get it to do. And I would say, 9 out of 10 times we would collaboratively work on that and get something that really suited our specific use case. And so that was my programming experience. Again, full disclosure, don't let me program your systems. If you see me programming your systems, please haul me away. It's not a good situation.
I can very much appreciate that. And quite honestly, it's been so many years that I've done programming hands-on that I'm in the same boat. So that's very respectful, but it's important, I think, to point out the need to understand it.
Yeah.
Even if you don't do it.
And also it gave me an appreciation for what the programmers have to do and the knowledge that they have to execute on these projects. Sometimes it is as simple as just pulling a different room config, making a couple of modifications and uploading it. But other times it's very much not, especially when we start talking about active learning and, we want this to be a Zoom room, but sometimes not a Zoom room. And we want it to be this and that. You really have to have a lot of different disciplines to just appreciate what the programmers are doing. So
it's exactly what I was hoping you were going to say. And I was going to have James jump in because, I think we touched on two parts of that there. One is knowing what you can ask for and what it's capable of and making and kind of holding the people that are working with you accountable. But the other side is understanding how much it takes to do what you're asking for and how hard it is. So James, how does that kind of play into your role? Because you're becoming a little bit more on the supervisory side rather than on the hands-on side as well.
So first, I kind of want to say here is I think we are actually hitting a market that Steve and I didn't think we would hit. Now listening to Richard and during InfoComm having Will in, these are two members who are listeners who are not programmers, but they're finding value from our show. I mean, I never thought of that. I know Steve and I joined this to make a community for programmers, but I think this is pretty cool. And this is showing value that we're providing. Now going to what you're saying, Steve, is yes, as I'm stepping into the manager role, having that knowledge of the background of the programming, I do know how long it takes. I do know what needs to be done. And right now I don't have a programmer on my staff. I'm still working on developing my team. They're hitting the training as we are going, so it's great. But I can sit here and talk to our integrator and say, no, this is how long it's going to take, when they might want to say, oh, it's going to take 5 months. No, I know you can do this in 2 weeks. Or they're going to say, oh, we can do that in a day. I'd be like, no, this is going to take you 6 months to do because it's more entail. Like I have that knowledge. I can almost smell out the BS that some people might be selling.
Yeah, the one that always got me, especially, again, I'm putting on my university hat a bit more, was when, the integrator would charge a set fee for programming of a room, but we would have like 5 or a dozen of the identical room. And I was always like, well, I can actually, the first one should be a lot more than that, but the second and the third and the fifth should be maybe a little bit lower. But yeah, I also appreciate, James, you're in a situation where you're going to be evaluating the people that you have, because I have never bumped into 2 programmers that are exactly at the same level with their programming skills. And it is very much a journey where, some of the initial user interfaces that I made at the university were just atrocious. And it took a while to kind of work toward a very clean, elegant user interface, even when I was just doing research and development projects, where, again, I think a lot of the programmers and the designers, they're kind of on a journey. And the challenge in higher education is, you may have an individual that is able to program incredibly well because they've been working with you and learning about the environment for 5, 6, 7 years, training up over all those years, and then they leave to go somewhere else. And it can be a major blow to a university, because then they have to go and find an individual that will meet that new standard or new expectation of what can be done in these rooms. And universities, a lot that I have worked with, are not prepared for a twofold salary increase with individuals when, you know, they understand C# or they understand Python in a programming environment. It's very powerful, but it's also a little concerning if I were the IT director that I have allowed somebody to get to master their skill to a point where we have become very dependent upon it. And that was one of my, you know, the configuration versus programmer conversation always pops up at that point.
Oh yeah, and I actually experienced that firsthand. Like, as we all know, I moved from a school in New Jersey to a school in Nevada, and when I was at the university in New Jersey, I was the in-house programmer, the only one. And I understand what Richard's talking about. Like, I was looking at that as a holistic view because I knew my goal was to get into management. I knew, okay, I can't be a only programmer if I want to get into management. So I was already looking at that holistically and trying to make it easier for other people to step in. And when I knew I was leaving, I had to dump off my knowledge to people taking over. And we actually kind of laughed because as I was training these new members who already work for the IT department, who already have their own duties, now this is just adding on to it. We were kind of joking because as we were walking and I was showing them in spaces, we bumped into a old boss of mine who I kind of took as a mentor for a while. And we were telling him everything that was going on, and he kind of chuckled and go, well, you need 3 people to replace 1 person. And even though these 3 people all had their special skills, but they weren't programmers in AV. They were learning, they were quick. And as I was telling these guys, I was like, look, you're going to look at my code and probably go, he's an idiot. We should be doing it this way. And that's what I wanted. Like I did prior to the person I took over for. I looked at their code and go, he's an idiot. We're doing it this way. I advance. Now they're advancing on mine.
The cycle continues, right?
Yep.
It brings up an interesting point too about the fact, because we talked about programmers and associating them with code, but part of what we know, there's some role there that talks about how do you define the functionality? How do you define what you want the system to do? Can you also have a role where somebody is writing the spec or the requirements to the point that anybody can just write the code, not necessarily be the only one who knows how the system should work and how to decipher your approach to the operation of a system versus the way the system is programmed. I think that sometimes we group those in together, and they could be 2 separate roles, in my mind, but I don't know if in reality that's the case.
Yeah, well, I think my perspective has shifted a little bit as time has gone on, because I was initially, I wanted platforms that were infinitely flexible. I wanted platforms that, I could create line code for and kind of really dig in, connect to databases and all these other things. Now I'm starting to, if I were ever to re-enter higher education, I think I'd take a long look at that, because the challenge with infinitely flexible is that it can also become infinitely customizable to one person's kind of way of programming. So I think IT managers that are kind of supervising these programmers have to also think about, sometimes being inside of a little bit of a box with your programming environment may actually be beneficial, because then it may not be something that can get out of hand to where you need a computer programmer. I had a senior manager that was quick to say, some of our web developers, when they enter, they come at a certain salary and certain expectation as to what you will be paying them. In general, AV people with arguably similar skills are paid at a different rate. And he's like, I can get 2 AV people in here for the price of 1 programmer. So I think there's a lot of, kind of going back to a previous comment, when you have very stringent budget constraints, it can be really challenging to maintain those staff people. So it's like a Pandora's box that you may have opened up.
I think that's a thing we see big in the AV industry. I see it talked about all the time on AV and AM and stuff, is how you could take, even take like someone like Steve or someone like me or Richard, and we same position, and you take them and put them in a true IT environment, they're going to be making double to, if not triple of what they're making.
Yeah.
Same skill, same person, just looked at differently. And that's what we need to try to improve, not just as AV programmers who are even smaller sample side of the AV industry as a whole. AV and as a whole, we need to look and improve the salary to match those IT people, because we are IT. Come at me, I don't care. How I feel. AV is IT.
I am an AV is IT as well person. Honestly, while tragic, COVID was probably one of the best things that happened to the industry in general, because a lot of universities I'm chatting with, they are rebanding a lot of these positions, because traditionally they just viewed them as, cart pushers in their, the old days. Well, Joe or Mary comes in, they put the cart in the room and they make the AV go. Those days are long, long gone. And, they've got to have an expectation of networking, a deeper understanding of networking, a deeper understanding of IT in general, the needs associated with building modern classrooms that tie into a lot of different things. The skill set's vastly different than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. And I'm seeing a lot of universities move really gracefully toward it, and then others still kind of resisting. Again, I can appreciate classrooms where we primarily focus on lectures, or, we don't have a lot of technology in the spaces, but a lot of universities, from the top down to, smaller community colleges, are really embracing technology because they want a more flexible future for themselves, regardless of where the students are, or regardless of where the faculty is. At the university I was at, some of the faculty would infrequently get COVID, no shock there. And the students could show up in the room the faculty was beamed in for that specific session, even if they were just in their office 4 or 5 yards away from where the classroom was. So it's just this very flexible future I see for the higher education segment specific to AV.
I agree. I actually had that conversation with a faculty member right as we were opening back up, and I was showing a system in the room that he was using that wasn't a traditional classroom, but it was a room we made a classroom for space. And we were chatting, and I told him, I was like, look, I understand COVID is bad. We all know the negative about COVID. I go, but now think about this. I just go, how many conferences do you go to that you have to cancel class? Now you don't. And he's like, I never thought of that way.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, you can jump in during a break in your conference, or record your session and then play it to your students in LMS. Like, we no longer have to worry about that snow day or class being canceled because of X, Y, and Z.
It does break my heart a little bit that we may not have snow days anymore, but I will be honest. It's also, I think when you introduce AV into these classrooms, I mean, you don't really have to change your teaching pedagogy. You can, I think it's just an enhancement, especially when you start talking about, students that English may be their second language, them being able to go back to a recording, re-listen to it a time or two to catch up some nuance that they weren't. And once you start articulating the need for it, it really is beneficial. Like again, the university I was working at, we had hybrid before COVID hit, where they were ready to go because we wanted to give flexibility to maybe MBA students or high-end, weekend kind of folks, where they could come to half of the classes or a third of the classes or 2/3 of the classes in person, and then the remainder of them they could phone in. So you were able to get a different caliber of person that needed that additional flexibility, but still wanted the rigor of that environment. So again, it's moving forward, I just see there being more and better AV integrated into these learning spaces. And I will admit, when I told the university I was moving into the manufacturing segment, they were like, you're going to move into AV in 2021. It seems like may not be a perfect time to do that. But, luckily Biamp has a great story to tell in that regard. So it's been a wonderful transition. But again, I'm lucky that I get to work in the segment that I just have an absolute passion for.
I think that's probably a good place for us to tie a bow on this episode, but great conversation, and I'd love to continue it. So we're going to have Richard back, and I think that there's some great topics that we can build off of here. Richard, how can people get in touch with you, learn more about Biamp?
Sure. Just send me an email, richard.mitchell@biamp.com. I am a email junkie, so that's the best way to get a hold of me if you want a very quick response.
Excellent. And to get in touch with Biamp or anything you're doing there?
Pardon me?
To get in touch with Biamp or anything special you want to talk about there?
Again, the company that I joined is already a different company just in the last 278 days that I've been there. Again, we're jumping into control and all these other things that I had not initially anticipated, but on day one of my job, first day of my job, they introduced 40 new products. So we're just expanding so quickly. It's a great time to be there.
Wonderful. And James, how can people get in touch with you, learn what you're up to, and read or listen to some of the content you're putting out?
Oh, as always, you can find me on Twitter on Sunday mornings with the AV in the AM. My Twitter handle is AV_James King. I'm on LinkedIn, but not much. As you mentioned, I also do another podcast, the AV Life, where I'm a crew member. I also write for the Higher Ed Digital Magazine, the IT and AV column, and I am a member of HEPMA. So wherever HEPMA is, you'll probably find me as well.
Wonderful. And for me, you can reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media. Some of the content I am working on is another control podcast called State of Control on avnation.tv, as well as some writings that I do for AV Network, my company blog at controlconcepts.net, and done a little bit with Commercial Integrator. So always want to be in touch there. And as James said, AV in the AM is a great place to find us on Sunday mornings. And I am fairly active on LinkedIn, so that's another place to connect as well. But please continue to share us feedback and let us know you're listening. And we want to have more people like Richard on the show and sharing perspectives and giving more insight as to how we could help to provide content that's going to be targeted to this audience, as well as open our mind to some new ideas. So please leave us a review or rating. You could find us on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as YouTube. And we'd love to hear from you. So that's it for today. And this has been Ask the Programmer.